Support for this News from Lake Wobegon podcast comes from the Sleep Number bed by Select Comfort, the bed that lets you adjust the mattress firmness to your preference, your sleep number. And by Bisquick Heart Smart Pancake and Baking Mix. With 0 grams trans fat and no cholesterol, Bisquick Heart Smart Pancakes are a delicious way to be good to your heart. Bisquick, real pancakes, real good. Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, Minnesota, my hometown, out there on the edge of the prairie. It turned bitterly cold, but it's January, so it's what we expect, and we're prepared for it. That's why God put us up here, because we're people who are not fazed by a little bit of cold weather. Ever so often, you could hear the ice cracking from the intense cold, trees cracking out there, and big billows of steam and exhaust coming up from chimneys and from cars. Beautiful cold day, and the smell of your nose hairs freezing, which is memorable and goes back to adolescence. Mr. Hoppy walked into the Chatterbox Cafe, and he said, "Well, it was so cold we had to chop up the piano for kindling." Somebody said, "How many chords did you get?" "1, and it was flat," he said. It's an old joke. He tells this every year, so it's kind of a test of who's suffering memory loss, whether you laugh at it or not. It's beautiful this time of year. It's cold. Everything slows down in Lake Wobegon. Life is not as frenetic as it is in the summer and the fall. That's one of the benefits of poor traction. You just tend to stay in one place. People come and visit you, and they stay, and they drink a lot of coffee, and that's why we make it the way we do, so that you can drink it all day and your hands won't shake. And then you say, "Well, I've got this casserole. It won't take long to heat this up, this scalloped potatoes with sausage." And they say, "Well, sure, I have a little bit of that and a little piece of pie." It's a very sociable, civilized time of year. Time when the snowmobilers are out, they're in their element. The snow is hard and crusted in this cold, cold weather, and they're bundled up and going hither and yon across the prairie. They tend to stay away from the lake. There have been accidents out there in the past, and the river as well. You want to stay away from the river when you are a snowmobiler. People have gone off on a river on a snowmobile, and they get excited, and pretty soon you've gone 30 miles, and it gets dark, and it's too late to come back home. And so you stay at a motel, or you stay with people you meet in a bar, and you don't know them, and it changes you in small ways. A trip down the river in a snowmobile, people come back from that, and they're different in small ways, maybe very small ways. Maybe in the past you used to drink your coffee black, and now you put milk in it and sugar. You never did that before, but this is a little crack in your life, you see, and then it opens up a little bit, and the next thing you know, you're walking in there, and you're wearing an odd shirt people have not seen on you before, with a kind of a tab collar that nobody in this town wears, and you're different in some way, and you come in, and people notice that you start to use phrases like, "At the end of the day," the bottom line is, when all is said and done, you're expressing opinions in a kind of a flat, confident way, instead of the way that we express them in Lake Wobegon, which we preface them by saying, "I may be all wrong about this. All I know is what I read in the papers." But there you are, and you're expressing these flat-out opinions, and pretty soon people don't sit down next to you in the Chatterbox Cafe anymore. And then when you tell people that you've gotten a job offer in Minneapolis, nobody says, that's, "You're not going to go, are you?" They don't seem reluctant to let go of you. Stay off rivers is the advice there. Mary Bomer came back for winter homecoming at Lake Wobegon High School. She was the star of the Lake Wobegon Blue Devils girls basketball team, 97, 98, 99. She was their high-scoring forward. She was a beautiful, player. She came back to receive the Distinguished Alumni Award at a ceremony at the gymnasium, an award that, let's be honest, has been given out for a lot of not that distinguished accomplishments, our alumni being who they are. But she was an exception. She walked onto the floor of the gymnasium where she had been a champion for years, playing for Miss Waters' teams. Miss Waters was a very complicated person, and she would draw up complicated diagrams of plays on a blackboard during timeouts, and the girls would look at them, all these ponytailed basketball players. And the chart could have been a map to the Northwest Passage, or it could have been the formula for the neutron bomb, but they looked at it, and she explained it all to them, and then on their way back into the game, they just leaned towards each other, and they said, "Give it to Boomer." That was her nickname. Mary Boomer. She started out with the nickname Chicken Legs, but gradually, as she established dominance as a basketball player, she came to be called Boomer. She went away to college. She went away and she changed completely, and here she was back in our midst. She had graduated first in her class in medical school, and she had qualified for the Olympic snowboarding team, and she had written a memoir in Spanish, which was published in Uruguay and Paraguay, a memoir about growing up in Lake Wobegon, which was a bestseller in South America, where they thought it was magical realism, even though everything in it was true. So she was a triple threat. She came out onto the floor to receive this award. None of these kids had ever seen her play basketball. It was too long ago. She walked out in her long black sleeveless dress and her high heels, and there was polite applause. And then some joker threw a basketball out to her, and she kicked off her high heels. And she dribbled in towards the key, and she made her jumper from about 20 feet out, swish. And it took a lucky bounce and bounced back towards her because of the backspin. And she picked it up and she drove towards the basket, and she made a reverse layup in her black dress, and she got a standing ovation. People were astonished at the nerve of someone from Lake Wobegon doing this. And suddenly people wondered to themselves, why did she have to move away to become this elegant, beautiful person? Why couldn't she have done this in our midst? Well, there was the reason, sitting right over there. Her father, sitting right in the front row of the bleachers, Mr. Bomer, a joker from way back, a satirist. He was the one who painted on the side of the water tower the words "ha, ha, 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 ha," on a part of the water tower where there's no catwalk, no scaffold. He rigged up some suction cups on his boots and on his gloves, and an enormous suction cup on his chest. And he painted this in a place that everyone else was afraid to even think about going there, and so they had to pay him to erase his own vandalism. He sort of dined out on that reputation ever since, Mr. Bomer. Mr. Bomer's been in the trucking business, and this last week he had a mishap out on the ice. His truck went through the ice. He was hauling rocks for the owners of a summer house on the north side of the lake who were worried about shore erosion, and so they hired him to haul 3 tons of rock out there and drop it onto the ice, where when the ice melts, it would fall through and secure the shore. But of course the rear axle of the truck went through, and Mr. Bomer leaped out of the truck. It went down slowly, like the Titanic. Just the rear wheels, and the front wheels were up. So he managed to call Clint Bunsen down to Bunsen Motors, who brought the wrecker, and they got a cable around the front axle, and Clint was going to tow it out, and then it started to slide in, and rather than have the wrecker slide in with it, Clint just pulled the release, and the cable went snapping out like a whip. It was like 200 feet long, just cracked around in a big circle, and it hit that fish house where Mr. Hoppy was sleeping. Thank goodness He was drunk and he was asleep on a top bunk. Otherwise, it would have cut him off right at the ankles. But it sent that fish house spinning off towards the Bergstrom's fish house and banged into the propane tanks, and the burst into flame, and Mr. Hoppy ran out in his bare feet, drunk, and there was Mr. Bomer. He said, I knew it was you. I knew it was you. I knew you'd be involved in this, because this is a joker. He's a satirist, and he sets a low example for his own children. It's Mr. Bomer, who was in the trucking business with Arnold Voss. This would have been back in the early 80s, back around the time that his daughter was conceived, and they were out in western Minnesota. They were doing maintenance on billboards with their big Mack truck, their big rear axle Mack truck, and they had a cherry picker rigged up on this thing, and they were working on billboards, and that blizzard came in without much warning. It just swept right in, and pretty soon there were 4 inches of snow on the ground, and blowing and drifting snow, and they folded up that cherry picker, and they headed for home, for Lake Wobegon, off to the northeast. They were the only vehicle out on the roads. Nobody else was around. And as they drove along, Arnold Voss was at the wheel, that Mack truck was having a harder time against the snow and the wind. He had to shift down to third gear and then down into second gear, and it was straining and straining and straining. They went about 18, 20 miles, and he was in first gear, and Mr. Bomer said, there's got to be something wrong with the truck. You better stop. Let me go around back, see if something's happened to the drive shaft. So they stopped. He got out into the blizzard. He could barely see his hand in front of his face. He came around back, and the cherry picker had come up. Somehow a tarp had come loose, and the flap had hit a control lever, and it had raised the cherry picker up, and it had collected about 20 miles of telephone line. It was hauling about 10 tons of copper down the road in front of it. Well, they laughed themselves sick. They got out the wire cutters and they cut themselves loose. It took them about an hour and a half to get cut loose. Arnold said, we better report this to the authorities. We can't, said Mr. Bomer. There are no phones. Well, they laughed and they laughed their heads off over all of that. Oh my gosh. They drove back to Lake Wobegon, having left this wreckage, this devastation behind them. It was from that incident that the legend of the Kensington Snowman arose in western Minnesota, this enormous primeval creature risen up from the cave depths down below the prairie, this enormous 20-foot creature with its sharp metallic cries. People had heard this out in the blizzard, and they found hair, and they found what seemed to them to be the footprints of some gigantic creature who was collecting wires and towing them along. They wreaked untold devastation on western Minnesota. Some people have not yet recovered. People, distant places, knew that this was a myth. This could not be true. But the people living on the prairie in the midst of a blizzard, the idea of some primitive, malevolent force just made sense to them. It seemed to explain a lot of things in their own lives, don't you see? Sitting by yourself in a living room, and you're on the phone to your daughter in Minneapolis telling her that you're all right during a blizzard, and suddenly the phone is ripped out of your hand, and it's ripped right through the wall. It goes right through the wall. What would that be? It would be some kind of an abominable snow person. That was Mr. Bomer. That was Arnold Voss. That's why these young people have to go elsewhere to achieve these distinctions. Because we are satirists. We are a race of satirists, a tribe of satirists in Lake Wobegon. Making fun of other people is our stock in trade. It is our great pleasure in life. But satirists have a certain weakness, and that's the inability to appreciate beauty, the great, vast, silent beauty of the world. Here was this young woman who left our town gawky tomboyish, awkward, a nerd, and came back to us beautiful in a long black sleeveless dress and hit a swisher from 22 feet. That's the news from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. The News from Lake Wobegon podcast is brought to you by Bisquick Heart Smart Pancake and Baking Mix. With 0 grams trans fat and no cholesterol, Bisquick Heart Smart pancakes are a delicious way to be good to your heart. Bisquick, real pancakes, real good.